Welcome to Let the Quran Speak. I'm Aisha, your host. When we think back to lessons of stories from the Quran, we often recall the one we hear most often: Prophet Adam, Noah, Moses, the popular, more common ones. But what about the ones that are not so common? What is hidden in these series that we can take away as lessons for today? In our new series, Exploring Uncommon Stories in the Quran, we're doing just this. We'll explore stories that are not so commonly talked about and also draw parallels with biblical narratives when possible. To launch the series, let's sit down with Dr. Shabir Ally. Welcome to the show, Dr. Shabir.
Pleasure to be on.
So we're starting a new series today about uncommon stories in the Quran. So I guess the first question to ask is, if Quran in its entirety is meant to be a form of guidance and wisdom, why is it that there are some parables that are not so common or not heard about a lot?
Yeah, of course, they're not heard about a lot in our generation, but at the time of the Quranic revelation, there must have been stories that had been known to the audience that would first be addressed by the Quran. Otherwise, the Quranic narrative would make no sense. The Quran basically presumes that people know the stories, and the Quran, rather than retelling the whole story, just simply draws out the moral lessons from the story. The Quran basically says, remember this story? Well, here is what you should know about it in terms of the morals of the story, the teaching or the lesson that comes out of the story.
And what are some of the stories that we're covering in this series?
Well, we'll be covering some of the, as you said, uncommon stories. So normally when we deal with stories from the Quran, we deal with the stories of the major prophets like Adam and Noah, Abraham, Moses, Jesus.
And we did a series on all
yes.
of those, yeah.
But in doing such series, such a series, in order to not prolong it too much, we often omit some of the lesser players, let's put it this way, in the Quran. And in this series now, we'll have a chance to highlight the lives or the stories that are not so frequently mentioned in the Quran, but they're there, or they're not so extensively covered. So which are the ones? We can talk about the people of the cave, which itself in a way is a sort of a major story. Mm-hmm. We can talk about Dhul Qarnayn, the one who is mentioned as the two-horned one, whatever that means. We'll have to explore that. There's Dhul Kifl, who is sometimes identified as Ezekiel from the Bible. Idris in the Quran, sometimes identified as Enoch from the Bible. Al-Yasa in the Quran, sometimes identified as Elijah from the Bible. So there are several stories, important ones.
Perfect. And I know when we were talking about the development of this series offline, you also mentioned we'll take a look at biblical narratives and how they parallel to the Quranic series where possible. So how are you hoping to complement those two?
Yes, I've already mentioned, as you know, that the Quran's references to these stories are very brief, as the Quran's references are to the stories of prophets in general. So where do we get the details that fill out the whole narrative, that add flesh to the skeleton, let's say? We get that flesh from the Bible. The biblical stories are more elaborative. They are, start at the beginning and end at the end, and the whole narrative in between. The Quran is just simply alluding to points within the story and drawing out the moral lessons. But if one know the whole story, usually the place to find the stories is the Bible itself. And Muslim scholars in the past have actually gone to the Bible, and in the earliest stage, they didn't actually consult the written copies of the Bible, but they consulted people who knew the biblical narratives. So they got the information by oral transmission. And they included that information in the commentaries on the Quran. So we'll find a brief mention of the story in the Quran, and in the commentaries written by Muslims in Arabic, we'll find the details which are often drawn from the Bible, but as the nature of oral sources, sometimes a lot of legends and tales are included which are not mentioned in the Bible. And these are interesting and entertaining in themselves, and sometimes worth mentioning for that purpose, but also for the purpose of analysis, to think about how these stories were once conceived by people at the time of the Quranic revelation, then by Muslim scholars in the commentaries, and how we should look at some of these narratives today and draw a sharp distinction between what the Quran actually says and what are some of the legendary accretions that people have brought into the narrative and is there fixed in the Muslim mind. So Muslims may have grown up with some of these stories. They could have heard them in their classrooms, they could have heard them as bedtime stories, or they just simply might have heard them delivered in sermons in Muslim mosques. But the stories would be a combination of the bare skeleton narrative that is mentioned in the Quran, plus some flesh from the Bible, but also a lot of legendary accumulation and accretions that sometimes are really very fantastic and incredible.
Sorry, go ahead.
And that could make the whole story unbelievable. And some modern intellectuals may simply brush aside the whole thing without drawing the distinction between what is the core element of truth that the Quran was drawing attention to, and that on the one hand, and on the other hand, all of the legendary accretions, which themselves, yes, should be now regarded as just simply incredible stories.
So just a question that maybe some of our Muslim viewers have, how would you address, so our series is Quranic stories, right, of uncommon stories. So if we're saying that we're going to rely on the biblical narrative, isn't that to a certain extent then taking away from the Quranic story? How would you bridge the two?
Well, it's important that we see the whole story as it is being told, as it was told, as it is generally known, that on the one hand. And then on the other hand, it is important for us to dissect these stories and separate the bare Quranic narrative, so that if somebody's saying, look, I can believe in the Quran, but I'm having great trouble with the story as it is told on the whole, we can say to that person, well, here is the bare Quranic narrative, and you can see that in the bare Quranic narrative there is no real issue, no problem. And so it is possible for such a Muslim to continue to say, yes, I believe in the Quran, including what the Quran says about this story, without necessarily believing in the entire story. But it is good to know the stories because it is part of a common discourse. We may hear the story being referred to, or some elements that are non-Quranic being described, and one needs to realize that this is not Quranic, and if it sounds incredible, then one doesn't have the crisis of conscience of thinking, well, wait a minute, can I really reject this story? The simple thing would be to say, okay, that part is not a Quranic part, and so by rejecting that part, I'm not rejecting the whole story, and I'm not rejecting the Quran's take on that story.
Perfect. And what are you hoping our viewers take away from this series?
Well, one of the things we will take away from it is that the Quran retells the stories not simply for entertainment, but mainly for moral values and teachings and lessons. And so by looking at these stories, we will be drawing out the Quranic lessons from these stories. We will actually be benefiting from the Quranic revelation, which gives its own unique perspective on the biblical and other stories.
I'm definitely looking forward to it. So thank you very much, Dr. Shabir.
You're welcome.
Hey YouTube, we hope you benefited from this video. If you liked it, or if you didn't, let us know in the comments below. And if you're interested in learning more, check out some of our other videos. And don't forget to subscribe so you can get new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday.